you're much less likely to snap things. So let's see how we did there. I did hear a snap. Could have been some other root. That is a very nice, look at this crabapple seedling here. Very, very. Friends, welcome back to the channel. We're up here in the nursery today, and today we're going to be talking all about these things behind me, these air pruning beds, what they are, why I use them, how I use them. When I talk about how I use them, we're really going to mostly in this video focus on getting the trees out of the beds when they go dormant in the fall. It's November right now. I can touch a little bit on how I build them and also what to do with the trees once you pull them out, storing the trees for winter. But I just posted a much longer form, kind of rambling, long video about what a day, or actually a week in the life of me looks like the nursery this time of year. And there I dove into some of the nitty-gritty details, some of the nuances of things that I see as I pull. You know, we're talking about thousands of trees. I've got about 30 of these beds, and so it's a lot of trees coming out. It's a lot of different scenarios, different soil mixes, different species of trees, right? And so that video was long. I think there's a lot of cool stuff in it, but I want to make a more concise, to the point, you know, how I'm doing, what I'm doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing. For those of you who don't want to sit through a 40-minute video to find those little nuggets of this little nuance about pulling trees out of air pruning beds. So here we go. Now, I built all my air pruning beds out of wood. They don't, strictly speaking, have to be wood. All it is it's some sort of container that holds soil. It's elevated up off the ground. I usually use cinder blocks or big pieces of, you know, concrete, big pieces of wood, like an old, you know, an 8x8, 6x6. But you got to have them up elevated off the ground. The bottom of the bed needs to be breathable. It needs to be exposed to air. So what I do is I have a hardware cloth mesh that's attached to the bottom of the bed that allows the bottom of the bed to be exposed to air. Now, there's other ways you could do this, right? I've made makeshift air pruning beds out of pots, out of old milk crates, plastic crates. You can get creative with it, but the way that I really like to do it is wooden rectangular frames and hardware cloth. That is just, for me, the most straightforward. It's pretty durable, can last a long time, and that's the materials I use, right? That's what they look like. Now, the way I see it, there's two major benefits you get from air pruning beds. One, you can see this hardware cloth cage that I put on top of the bed. This cage makes it difficult, almost impossible, usually impossible. Sometimes, you know, rodents can get through, but usually you can completely exclude rodents with these cages. And that's important if you're growing trees from seed, especially nut trees, things, you know, the prunus, the stone fruits. Those seeds are really valuable food to all sorts of rodents. And so being able to plant the seeds and know that a squirrel or a mouse isn't going to come dig them up is important. This is one easy way to exclude the rodents. Now, the other major benefit, the benefit that air pruning beds are really named for, is the air pruning quality of the beds. And what that means is that as a tree sends its root down into this bed, it keeps going down and down and down. What happens then is that the leading tip of the root, usually the taproot, is going to hit this bottom area where it's exposed to air. The very tip of that root is going to dry off. It's going to dry down and die back, okay? And that may sound bad, but it's actually good because it's a very, very minor damage. The root tip is very small, and the root's growing slowly. And what it does is it tells the tree, I can no longer grow in this direction. I need to seal off the taproot and send out horizontal spreading roots. Then what happens is, in the fall, you can go and pull these trees out very easily without damaging the taproot, because the taproot is not going down, you know, very, very deep into heavy soil. It's in this nice loose soil. You can get your hand or your shovel up underneath of it and pry it out. And the taproot, although it stopped growing because it was air pruned, it's not dead or damaged. And so when you transplant that tree, it can keep sending its taproot down almost as if nothing happened. It also then has a lot of horizontal feeder roots to help it feed and help, you know, it lowers the transplant shock. Bare root trees, when they're dug intentionally and carefully from beds like this, can have very minimal transplant shock. Now, not every nursery grows their bare root trees in a situation like this. And so sometimes you can get bare root trees from certain suppliers, growers, where the roots are very damaged in the process of digging them up out of whatever bed that they're in, and they can experience higher transplant shock. So it depends on the quality of the tree, how it's grown and dug and handled. But that, in a nutshell, is the benefit of air pruning beds. I only use them if I have a taprooted species that I want to grow and be able to easily dig without damaging the taproot, or if I have a species where the seed is highly desired by rodents. So all of the stone fruits, pretty much all of the nuts that I grow, as well as species like persimmons and pawpaw, which are, you know, the rodents don't really want those seeds, but they tend to be taprooted. And so you can get very nice pawpaws and persimmons out of these air pruning beds. Now, one thing that's important is that as I build them, first of all, you have to put a lot of support structures on the bottom to really clamp this hardware cloth in good. And because there's a lot of weight of soil pushing down on that hardware cloth. So lots of supports, lots of bracing. It's also important to me that there's 2 rectangular frames. So there's no hardware cloth under this top frame. It just lifts right up. When I do that, some of the soil comes out. You know, that was for demonstration. Typically, I'm not moving these top frames until I go to dig the trees. But that way, when I take the cage off in the fall, I can then take the frame off, and you can really get access to the soil to get your hand or your shovel in there underneath to dig up the trees. Now, I've got a few beds left to dig today. I'm running a little bit low on time. I got a bit of a late start this morning, so I got to get to it. I am going to record some clips that you'll see right here of me digging them up. The biggest tips I can give you, first of all of this is easier if you have more than one person. I'm usually out here doing this alone, and so lifting these cages and these frames, you got to be careful. You got to go slow. You know, keep your back straight, activate your core, lift with your legs. Be smart about how you're doing this if you're doing it alone, and know that, you know, if you can convince a friend or a family member, someone to come help you out, at least for getting the heavy cages and the frames off the beds. Very helpful. And especially if you have larger beds. Most of these beds I built are 2 feet by 2 feet. You can build them really any size that you want. I've made 2x4, 2x3, 3x3. I like these 3x3 beds. They hold so much soil that it takes a long time for them to dry out. You don't have to water them as frequently as the smaller beds, but they are, you know, lifting a frame like that on your own is a challenge. So keep that in mind. Do what works for your context. All right, so we've got all of our tools assembled here. We've got the shovel. You want a shovel that is flat. This is not perfectly flat, but it's flat enough. You don't want like your typical spade that has kind of a curve to it. We've removed the top cage and we've removed the top frame, so we've exposed some of the soil down in here. And we've got a bucket of water. Is that in the frame? Yeah, well, you can sort of see. There's a bucket of water right here. And what we're gonna do, you could use your hands. Some people like to wear gloves, I don't. But you come in here with the shovel, just pick a spot to start. I typically pick on a corner. And you push straight down until you can be confident that the shovel is at the bottom of the bed. And then you're gonna do a gentle lifting up, like this, slow and gentle. If you feel a lot of resistance, don't push it. Take it out, start in another spot, go all the way down again, pry up nice and slow. And what I'll tell you, these beds are much easier to dig when they're well hydrated. If the soil gets too dry, it's harder to tease things apart. The other thing, one moment, the soil that falls out of this bed is high quality soil. We could let it fall on the ground if we were going to be doing gardening in this area, but there's black landscape fabric on this patch right here that we're gonna pull the plastic off this winter. But for now, any soil that I spill is kind of getting wasted. It's just gonna sit on the plastic until we pull it up. So I try to collect the soil as I dig. But I just get my hands in here where I put the shovel and I'm loosening with my fingers. And sometimes I do a little bit of a shaking action and I try to see, there's a tree here, meaning the root is typically below it. And I try to trace it with 2 of my fingers and I'll grab onto the root and give a gentle tug in the upward direction. If it doesn't come out immediately, I will go lower down on the root and keep going lower and jiggling and tugging until sometimes the root goes sideways. This one goes all the way over here. I'm tracing it with my pointer finger, jiggling. When I feel like I've got it and it's about to come out, I want to make sure that I'm gripping the root hard with all my fingers as low as I can go, and then gently pulling it out. And here we pulled out what I can show you guys. This is a persimmon seedling. Now this is very atypical, but every now and then you'll get a tree that hits some sort of debris and the root shoots sideways. Typically they go straight down, but you can see if this tree was here and I had pulled straight up, I would have likely snapped this root. We're gonna put this immediately into the bucket of water. We want them to be well hydrated. You don't want your trees to dry out. When they're bare root like this, the name of the game is keeping them hydrated. That's the big risk. These apple trees are not totally dormant. They've still got some of their leaves, but they're dormant enough. We've had some frosts. They're certainly entering their dormancy. So I'm just gonna keep kind of jiggling this. And I'm gonna see, here's my next tree. I'm going to kind of reach around, feel around for the root. Which direction does it go? This one was ready to come out, and I'm just kind of tickling, teaseling it out. And we can see it's not totally free, so I'm going to grab all of it right here and do a little bit of that action. And here you can see we pulled out some other roots with it, and there's some mycelium in here. But here is a nice crabapple seedling. Now, crabapples are not typically very taprooted in my experience, so you can see not a super thick developed taproot, but the root system is totally intact. Let me get at it and do the rest of these crabapples. Again, just like so. So now I'm kind of grabbing a clump, take this whole clump of trees. I'm going to do a little bit of that action, and we can pull them apart. Here's a bigger crabapple root mass. And I want to show you guys something. I'm just going to put these in the bucket real quick. We have some damage that occurred. If I hold this like this and come up to the camera, you can see that white spot where a root broke off. Now, that's not ideal. I pulled too hard. I must have pulled in the wrong direction. I wasn't going quite slow enough, perhaps. This is going to happen even if you're very careful. You're going to get a handful of these in every bed. This tree will live. It will be fine. That's a wound that is of a size where it can certainly handle that. Like I said, not ideal, but I have no problems planting a tree with that amount of minor damage. You may choose to do it differently, but I have found them to be totally fine. If it was more significant, if we had snapped off this root here, that would be more significant. At that point, the tree probably would still be okay, but I would not want to distribute it. This is still a distributable, sellable tree in the nursery that I feel very happy and confident about sending out into the world. So we're going to get these, again, soaking in the bucket, and I'm just going to keep going. Catch you in a minute. I want to see if you guys can see what's going on here. Sometimes I like to get the shovel so far underneath that I can do some of this action. We're really prying up a lot on this. And again, we are being gentle. We want to be listening for snapping sounds that we don't want, feeling how much resistance you're getting in the shovel. And then I'm just kind of, there's a lot of the jiggling action happening. And again, tracing the roots. If you pull from this point, you're very likely to snap. If you can get your hand down deep, closer to where the root ends, and pull from down there, you're much less likely to snap things. So let's see how we did there. I did hear a snap. Could have been some other root. That is a very nice, look at this crabapple seedling here. Very, very nice, solid tree. So, excellent, excellent. And looks like we got another big one here. Let's see. No damage on this one either. Another, again, very nice, large tree. So, into the bucket she goes. On to the next one. It's actually getting a little bit sunny out here today. It's a beautiful day. It's probably 50s, 60s, I don't know. Anyway, I just dug this bed of black walnuts behind me. I didn't film it. It's the same process as what we did with the apples. Left my hair tie in the house, so I'm actually using the hat more to keep my hair up. It's not actually cold enough to need it. But anyway, what I wanted to mention, when can you start digging the trees out of the air pruning bed? And is there risk of frost damage if you leave them in too long? Is there risk of them dying if you transplant them too soon? You pull them out of the beds too soon? This is something I struggled with a lot when I first got started. To some extent, I still don't know what the full answer is. Here's the thing. We're growing mostly native species, and the non-native species that we do grow, there's not that many of them, but the ones that are non-native, like those crabapples, for example, although actually there is a native crabapple species, and I don't know what species that crabapple is. Anyway, all the species we grow here are well adapted to this zone. We're in 7B-ish down here in southwestern Virginia. And so because these trees are adapted to this climate, they can handle the frosts this time of year. They know what they're doing. What I have noticed, though, no leaves on the trees in the landscape except for the evergreen, the pine needles. There's still, the crabapples have some leaves. Some of these elderberries have some leaves over here, although they've been hit by the frost. They're kind of curly and sad. But what I typically see is that 1-year-old first season seedlings, especially in a nursery context where they're given tons of access to water and nutrients, they will hold on to their leaves sometimes longer than the older, more established trees in the landscape will. And so as a result, sometimes those first few frosts can damage the leaves on these trees. It doesn't really hurt the tree. It's not ideal. It sets them back a little bit. And sometimes if the top stem of the plant, let's see if I can find an example here. I'll show you on these. I don't expect this to happen on the crab apples, but sometimes if you have a really green, tender, thin tip of the plant, apples are specifically very frost hardy in my experience, but something like pawpaw, for example, that's maybe not as frost hardy, sometimes you can get a little bit of dieback on the top leader, the leading, tip right here. Again, not ideal, but the trees can handle it. They die back an inch or two. In the spring, they'll just resprout from that point on the stem. So I don't worry too much about frost damage to the leaves really at all. Some people, a lot of people, when you talk about nursery work, they assume you have a greenhouse and you're working inside, controlling the climate for the trees. For these native plants and the non-natives that do well in this region, not a concern. What I do worry about, these beds are up above the ground. As we showed, I was down there on the ground. Air can get up underneath. They're not plugged into the earth. And so as a result, they will freeze long before the ground will freeze. They can get much colder than the ground. They can dry out much faster because the wind, it can evaporate from the bottom and the top of the bed. And so there is a risk, especially in wintertime, of the plant, because you're not really watering in wintertime. There's a risk of drying out. There's a stronger risk of freeze damage to the roots. Now, again, these plants are adapted to live in this environment where the ground does freeze sometimes, although honestly not often, at least in modern times. You go back 30 years, the ground froze pretty hard here, but nowadays it doesn't happen too much anymore. When it does freeze, it doesn't freeze very deep and it doesn't freeze for very long. It does still occasionally. The ground does freeze. But all I'm saying is the roots can handle some level of freezing, but there is a limit, especially on the smaller 1-year-old seedlings. I think these trees are actually pretty large and pretty nice for a 1-year-old seedling, but they're still small in the grand scheme of things. And so I want to get them out of these beds before we get a really harsh frost. Anytime when it's going to be like in the 20s for an extended period of time, even if that's just like 12 hours overnight, preferably I'd have the trees out. And so that's typically, I'm up against that window. I also, as a nursery, I want to get trees shipped as fast as I can so people can transplant them into the ground. So it's kind of a mad dash this time of year. And the question is, how early can I start pulling them out of the beds? You want to start as early as you can to get ahead of these windows that we're up against. I find like those apples, if I was going to wait for them to lose all their leaves, who knows when it would be. They'd stay, we've had freezes in the 20s already, and they still have green leaves. So it's not always as simple as wait for the leaves to drop. I like to wait at least for there to be a color change happening in the leaves. And for me, in this climate, what I have found is that typically anytime in October, I can start digging. If they start showing color change in the leaves in September, you could start digging them then. You can dig them a little on the early side. The main thing is just keep them well hydrated as you dig them, put them right in that bucket of water. And then when you get them healed in, which is what we'll talk about next, storing them over the winter. If you're not going to just plant them right away, if you're going to take a tree out of this bed and plant it in its final home immediately, you don't have to worry about storing them. But when you're growing a lot of trees in these beds, usually you're going to have to store them in between digging them out of the bed and getting them planted or getting them shipped, distributed, whatever your end goal is for the trees. So when we talk about storing bare root trees, we say they're healed in. That's the phrase we use. And like I said, that's what we'll talk about next. So here, I'll show you guys a black walnut coming out of this bucket. Black walnut, as I said, are one of the best examples of what air pruning can do. So you can see we have a very thick, very developed taproot here. It's not damaged. When this tree goes in the ground, that taproot can start growing again, but it's got lots of horizontal, fibrous, very healthy root system, very nice and easy to transplant. That tree should take off when it goes in the ground. I will also say that although I want to preserve the taproot, most of the taprooted species, you can damage the taproot and they'll just grow another one as long as they have access to water and nutrients when you transplant them. Like with proper tree care, a severed taproot, a damaged taproot does not mean the tree is destined for death. It could, right? They can suffer and die from that, but usually, most of the time, they're okay. Hickories are maybe one exception where they can be very upset if their taproot gets damaged. But for most of the other taprooted species, it's not the end of the world if they do get damaged, just so you know if you do run into that. Now, one other brief thing to note, we'll talk in more detail about building the beds, how I build them, and what I use to fill them up, probably in a future video. We've talked about this a ton in the past, but I want to do an updated take. But just for right now, briefly, I build these frames. They're just rectangles for the top frames. I use the Torx screws because they're easy to put. I like using 3-inch screws. This is 2x6 lumber is mostly what I do. The bottom frame, I put a ton of braces on it, and I'll overlay some footage here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Just like I said, to support the hardware cloth. I fill the beds, and this is not the recipe. You don't need to copy me exactly on this, but I use mostly leaf compost, rotting leaves or rotting aged wood chips, and I mix in some worm compost that I make myself here in the nursery. Sometimes I mix up my food scraps with wood chips and let that sit for a while and make like a homemade compost that's a little bit different than what comes out of my worm bins. Sometimes I just take the compost that was, you know, the chicken litter in the coop that we scrape out of the coop. We let it sit for like 6 months, a year. Sometimes I use that, but I mix in some sort of homemade compost that's a little bit higher in nutrients. And I mix it with mostly, like I said, aged leaves, aged wood chips as my medium. And I don't talk a whole lot about Living Soil Tree Farm, my name, what it means to me. I think that's a whole video on its own. But just for here, what's important is that this soil is very alive. I don't know that it's exactly the perfect, you know, microbial balance and chemical balancing for these trees. I'm not doing any sort of lab testing on any of that. And each bed is a little bit different in terms of what the soil composition looks like. But it's alive. Every time I'm digging in these beds, I see worms, I see millipedes, pill bugs, fungi. There's all sorts of crazy stuff going on in these beds. That's why I call it Living Soil Tree Farm, because I am doing my best, I think, to promote life, healthy balances of life, microbes, and larger soil organisms in the beds. So that's a little bit on what we fill in with, how we mix them up. Let's get some trees healed in. I'm going to go and dig a few more beds first, and then we'll see you while we're digging them in. All right, folks, here we are at the tail end of the garden, and we're getting the trees healed in. As I said, this is how we're storing them. They're in their bare root configuration. They just came out of a bucket of water, so they're nice and hydrated, and we're building these mounds of very loose soil. This is mostly aged leaf compost and other organic matter. It's very loose. You know, we've only been gardening in this soil for 1 year, so if we had really loose garden soil that we'd been working on for years, we could dig holes and put them straight into the garden. But since we're still building up the soil here, I'm bringing in a lot of loose, crumbly, organic matter. And we're just going to take this and we're fluffing it in. The idea is we want to try to avoid air pockets from forming in here. So we're doing a lot of shaking around, a lot of this, right? Let it kind of come in there. We're going to water them and mulch them after we get the soil all fully covered up on them here. Now we just need to cover them with wood chips and water them in. You can see the rest of this area where you can sort of see bundles of trees sticking out everywhere. Nice and mulched. A lot of them have lost their leaves, obviously, so they're just basically sticks sticking out of the ground. This is by no means the only way that you can heal in plants. Healing them in, right, like I said, the storage for bareroot trees, this is in-ground storage. We're storing them in the garden. We've got this fence, which is electrified. Not right now, obviously, because I'm touching it, but to discourage the deers and to discourage possibly the groundhogs, rabbits, you know, animals that may want to come in and browse the stems of the trees, the tasty bark in the wintertime when there's not much other food. So this is a relatively protected area that we can have them. They're in the ground, which is going to mean that basically I'm not going to worry about them freezing too much. Like I said, in the ground, you know, these trees are adapted to being in the ground here in the winter, all of these species. Above the ground is different. So in the past, I have healed trees into basically just large nursery pots. I'll throw some footage up on the screen, but basically just doing the same thing I'm doing in the ground, but instead in a very large pot with a lot of loose soil and a big bundle of trees in one pot. The problem is that pot sits above the ground, and so it gets much colder than the ground. And so to overwinter, to store the trees healed in pots, you have to pile a bunch of mulch around them, a bunch of leaves, wood chips, whatever, hay, to insulate that pot, prevent it from becoming so cold. A lot of folks up north and a lot of larger nurseries will actually store the trees in a climate controlled. They'll heal them into a climate controlled situation like a root cellar or some sort of room that they can keep cold enough to keep the trees dormant, but not so cold that they're getting damaged. But without making it any more complicated or vague, that's what healing in looks like. You want to keep, the main goal is keep the roots moist, keep them insulated from some of the worst parts of winter. If you're like north of zone 6, maybe look into what people are doing in colder regions. If you're any warmer than zone 7, you can probably do exactly this. You know, if you're way down there like zone 9, 10, maybe look and see what people are doing. I don't even know if things go dormant down that far south, so depending on your context, right? But that's healing in. But that pretty much does it for this video, and I'm gonna go, and I don't know if we'll record it, but I am gonna throw some wood chips on these, water them, as we stated. I think that covers pretty much everything I want to talk about air pruning beds, what they are, why I use them. All throughout winter, fall and winter and early spring, as long as I've got trees. Anytime that the ground is not frozen, I can pull trees out of storage. I can ship them. I could plant them in the ground. I could pot them up in the greenhouse. Anytime the ground is not frozen, I can work with these trees, so long as I keep them hydrated, and however many, if I pull a bundle out and I don't use them all, put whatever it is back and make sure they stay hydrated that whole time. Cover them back up with loose soil and mulch. For us, most of the winter, I can be moving these trees. There might be a few days, a few weeks here and there where the ground really freezes, or maybe even if the ground's not frozen, there's a bunch of snow on the ground or rain coming down, I might not want to work, but we can move trees throughout a lot of winter. I'm gearing up next week to start shipping, and so hopefully we're going to whittle through these trees pretty fast, get a lot of them out of here fast as we can, shipped out to you wonderful folks. If you want to buy some trees, we will likely still have a lot of them available at the time that I post this video, although I don't know exactly when I'm going to post it yet, so you can check the links in the description, the website and all that, or reach out if you're interested. We'd love to send you some trees. Hope y'all are doing well. Let me know what questions you have about any of this. Thoughts, questions, love to hear it. Let me know. We can dive deeper in future videos. And as always, appreciate y'all for being here. Catch you in the next one.